today's video, we dive into 5 different decks for newer players who want to get into competitive Magic. Each of these decks do range from different playstyles depending on the Magic player you feel like you are. With that being said, everybody, hi, I am ScarTV coming at you with another Magic the Gathering video. If you're new here and like the video, hit that like button. It definitely lets me know you guys like these style of videos. If you want to know when I post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But let's dive into the first deck and let's talk about it. So the first deck up on the list is going to be Golgari Deathtouch. The reason why I chose this deck list, with it being very simple and straightforward on how it plays. Essentially, our win condition of the deck is to kind of focus our Deathtouch creatures and play a card called Fing the Fanbearer, who is like our Deathtouch lord essentially, because every time a creature we control with Deathtouch would deal damage to an opponent, we get to put 2 poison counters on them, and if our opponent gets a 10 poison counters, they lose the game. So essentially it turns our 1/1s into actually pretty decent threats, because we just got to get, these to do 5 damage to our opponents. So every, pull of 5 creatures have to hit our opponent or they're dead. And essentially most of the cards in our deck are on the cheaper side. Bloodchief Thirst is a 1-cost removal spell that we can pick to, remove things that are, 2 mana or greater, which is pretty good, as well as Planeswalkers. Valmir Knight is a very interesting card. Sure, it's a 1/1 Death Toucher, as well as in the later game, if we really want to draw a couple cards, we can always tap 3 at instant speed and draw a card and lose the life. Moss Viper is a 1-mana green Death Toucher. Very simple, straightforward. Tarju Blightblade is a 1-mana Death Toucher. Yet again, definitely a good card to have. Start early. This is definitely a deck that takes advantage of going first. Go into our 2-drop slot. We got, like I said, the Fing the Fangbearer. He is like the meat and potatoes of the deck, because if we get him out, we could essentially, win the game quicker. If we hit him on turn 2, it puts even more pressure on our opponent if they are playing a slower deck and they can't get a lot of bodies on the battlefield to slow down our creatures. Essentially getting our Death Touch, our poison clock going much quicker. We got Rabbit Bite and Ram Through, both essentially doing the same thing. Each of them make one of our creatures deal damage to target creature equal to its power. We have Rabbit Bite at sorcery speed, and we also have Ram Through at instant speed. It's a 4-in-1, so 5 other spells that can definitely, kill a creature that may be in our way. Because our creatures have Death Touch, this damage will automatically kill them because it deals Death Touch damage to them. We have Shovel in here. He is one of those cards that you can flex in if you, don't have him in particular or have the wild cards to craft him. He's a 2-mana 1/3 with Death Touch, and at the beginning of our upkeep, if your opponents control no permanents with bounty counters on him, we can put a bounty counter on him. Whenever an opponent controls with a bounty counter on it dies, we gain 3 life and we draw a card. There's many cards that you can do at the 2-drop slot. Something like Mire Triton rings the bell, which is a pretty decent 2-drop here that we can put in place. Sure, it doesn't do the draw effect or the bounty counter effect or anything like that, but it's still a 2/1 Death Toucher that puts 3 cards in our graveyard, and I think we gain 2 life automatically, so that's a decent replacement in case you don't have that. Call the Deathwiller helps us get back things from our graveyard back onto the battlefield. Most of our creatures already have Death Touches, so that Death Touch counter doesn't really do much, but Menace makes it harder for our opponent to block our Death Touchers, because they have to, put 2 creatures to, block that particular creature that is attacking it with Menace, which makes it much tougher for our opponent to figure out how to block properly. Hooded Blightfang is another interesting card in the deck, because it's a snake that, besides it being a 1/4 Death Toucher, whenever a creature we control with Death Touch attacks, each opponent loses 1 life and we gain 1 life. So it essentially puts a different clock on our opponent's life total, even though our creatures are very weak, essentially allowing our 1/1s and 1/3s and all that stuff. They essentially now will deal 1 life leeching style damage, so they lose 1 life, we gain their life essentially. So definitely another way to win a game that way, especially if we're not drawing our Fin immediately in the early game. As well as whenever a creature we control with Death Touch would attack a Planeswalker, we get to actually destroy that Planeswalker regardless of loyalty, because essentially now Death Touch works against Planeswalkers in that manner. Then we got Baragoth the Bloodsky Sire. It's a 3-mana 2/3 Death Toucher with Boast. Target player searches their library for a card, shovels it, and put on top of their library. So essentially he is another way that helps us kind of search our library, possibly for that Fin that we may not drawn yet. And then we can tap the 2 mana and essentially put it on top of our library. Then you got Grim Dancer at the 3-mana slot. It's a 3/3, but it's interesting here because it's a creature that comes into the battlefield with 2 counters on it that are either Menace, Death Touch, or Lifelink. So it depends on what our opponent is doing. We can always put a Menace and Death Touch counter. If our life total is getting low, we can put Death Touch and Lifelink, which essentially helps us keep life. I would say it's one of those things that you may need to figure out based on the situation. If we're trying to get in for that, last little bit of Death Touch damage to hopefully kill our opponent with poison, I would say, you kind of judge it based on that. You got Nighthawk Scavenger, which is a one of. It is Flying Death Toucher Lifelinker. That's 1 plus the number of card types in our opponent's graveyard. So if our opponent's put a lot of things in their graveyard, it can become a very strong, big Lifelinker Death Toucher in the air that your opponent has to kind of figure out what to deal with. So depending on where the situation is and what part of the game you are on, this can become a decent threat to our opponent's overall life and helps us gain some life back, especially if we're getting low. Then we got Agadeem's Awakening, which is an interesting card here. One, we can play it as a land that I'm blocking and pay 3 life to have it come into the battlefield untapped. Or we can play the spell itself, which is 3 black, and then we tap X. And essentially, whatever we tap X for, we have to return target creature cards that each have the different mana costs of X or less onto the battlefield. So if we tap it for 3 for the X, we can essentially bring back a 3-drop, a 2-drop, and a 1-drop. So depend on the situation. If our opponent decide to board wipe, we can always, Agadeem's Awakening and get our creatures back after a board wipe. Then in the 4-drop slot, this is yet again another, thing that you may not need. You can always, swap it and add in more of another card if you don't have Quest and Beast. But Quest and Beast is a very good 4-drop in the basis of 1, it has Vigilance, 2, it has Death Touch, and 3, it has Haste, which makes it already very strong. The other thing too that makes it great, it has a paragraph of text if you don't know what it does, but it can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less, so essentially your opponent can't chump block it. They have to actually commit something that's stronger than 2 or more, or it has to be 3 or more essentially to block it. And if we deal damage to our opponent's face, it actually also does that damage to our opponent's planeswalker, so it has a way to kind of hit planeswalkers and opponent's life totals at the same time. Vigilance just helps because you can attack in and also have defenses back up. Their opponent never really wants to attack them with a Quest and Beast unless they have something that can actually kill the Quest and Beast back. So overall makes Quest and Beast an overall very strong card. And of course we got Bind of the Old Gods. One, it's another way for us to destroy target non-land permanent, so if our opponent plays anything besides creatures that we can't target with any of our spells or removal spells, we can destroy that non-land permanent. 2, it has a ramp effect on its second chapter, which helps us ramp up a little bit quicker, helps us find a particular mana if we maybe need that 1 additional black mana for something like an Agadeem's Awakening. We can definitely search that up. And the third chapter is it gives all our creatures Death Touch, which all the creatures have Death Touch, but if there was any instance where you had a creature in the deck that didn't have Death Touch, now they all have Death Touch. As for the mana base, it's 6 swamps, 6 forests, 2 dark boar pathways or slither boar pathways, depending on I don't know which one's face up one. And we have 4 Temple of Miladies. Now with this deck, I mean it's overall pretty straightforward. It is pretty much budget friendly. If I didn't say how many total rares there are in the deck, there are 12 rares and 3 mythics. Like I said, they're all replaceable, and you can slowly work your way to them if you don't maybe have them. But I would say if you have a few rares and a few mythics, I would say maybe cut back on the lands and then work your way back in the lands as you acquire more rares and mythics. Whereas like a lot of the creatures and stuff in the deck, I would say those are probably more priority than the lands. Sure, if you have untapped mana like the pathways, you'll be able to play things on a better curve. But worst case scenario, you can always play the untapped uncommon or the tapped common uncommon lands if you need them in the deck that can splash for one of the other colors. But overall, the deck is pretty straightforward. Now, as for ranking, I would say this deck is at a basis of a scale of 1 to 3. I'm still working on this scale thing. For simplicity, this deck is a 1 on the basis of it's a Death Touch deck. We're trying to hit our opponent with Death Touch creatures, just trying to hopefully get in the Fang Bear on the battlefield so we deal poison damage to our opponent. If not, we have a bunch of Death Touch creatures that just swing in with Death Touch Tribal. As for strength, this deck is actually pretty good, especially if we get a pretty decent curve and get something like Fin out on turn 2, and we're able to hit our opponent pretty consistently in the early game, and they're already at a high poison counter by like turn 3 or turn 4, because essentially at that point they have to start removing our creatures or get more blockers out, or our opponent loses the game. Then as for cost, I would say yet again, out of all my decks I'm going to be posting in this video, this is actually the cheapest of them all. So I would say this is actually the cheapest deck, so therefore the cost is at a 1 out of 3, meaning that it is on the cheaper side. Now this next deck on the list is actually a deck I did something similar to already on the channel. I did a budget version of it, so I do have a budget version of this deck if you're looking to play this deck, but in a cheaper manner. But this essentially is mono black Lurrus or mono black Auras, whatever you want to call it. Essentially, the idea of this deck is that we're trying to play these auras, something like Deadweight and Mire's Grasp, which is enchant creature and give it -2/-2, and enchant creature, give it -3/-3. The reason why I think this deck is actually pretty good in the current meta is even though mono white has indestructible creatures, or ways to give their creatures indestructible, the -- actually is a way to go around indestructibility. So that gives it that benefit, because if an indestructible creature goes to less than 0 for power and toughness, it just dies. So there is that. So that's the one thing that why this card deck is pretty good, especially against a mono white meta. I do think the one area where I think this deck is not going to be as strong against is a person who's playing a bunch of control. Like they're playing a control deck that doesn't play a lot of creatures, because this deck thrives on our opponent having things out on the battlefield. So if our opponent doesn't have things on the battlefield, we are going to be at a disadvantage. But with that being said, the overall deck list, yet again, because we're playing Lurrus as our companion, is on the cheaper side. Other than a few spells, our overall curve is at 4, less than 4. But majority of our cards are at 2 or less. Our 1-drops are Archfiend's Vessel, which is a pretty decent card. So 1/1 lifelinker that if it goes to the graveyard and we return it back from the graveyard to the battlefield from the graveyard, we get a 5/5 demon instead by exiling Archfiend's Vessel. Of course, we got the Deadweight as our 1 removal spell. It's a 1 mana -2/2 to enchant a creature. The reason why it's so good is we play a card called Hateful Eidolon. This is our way of our deck in advantage, because every time an enchanted creature dies, draw a card for each aura we control attached to that creature. So if we enchant our opponent's creatures with our Deadweights and our Mire's Grass, we're going to draw a card every time those creatures die. We got Mogi's Favor, which is like kind of like our protection if our opponent's playing something like Rogues and they're milling things into our graveyard. This is our way to kind of help mitigate, our graveyard from being so big. Sure, we only exile 2 other cards and pay 3 mana to reoccur it, but this is one of our ways to kind of protect ourselves from that. And the other benefit too is if we want to get a little bit aggressive with the deck, because the deck overall doesn't have a really big creature, this helps our creature, our creatures get much bigger, and if our creature dies in the process and we have something like a Hateful Eidolon out, we'll be able to draw a card at least. But it gives target creature +2/-1, but just another spell that gives a -2 toughness, which helps us out overall in the end. Next card up is Village Rites. This is another card that we can use to help us kill a creature off that may have an aura or something like that may have served its purpose. But essentially, we can sacrifice a creature we control. We can draw 2 cards for 1 mana instant speed, which is definitely very good. We have Kitesail Freebooter. It's a 2 mana 1/2 flyer that enters battlefield. Target opponent reveals their hand. We get to choose a non-creature nominate card from it. Exile that card until it leaves the battlefield. So just another way to disrupt our opponent's game plan. For 2 mana, it's a very solid card. Sure, it dies to something like a removal spell, but the benefit here is that before our opponent can play that removal spell, we can look at their hand and maybe take that removal spell from them if that's their only one. So there is that benefit there. Then we got Mire's Grass, which is our other removal spell in the deck. It gives target creature -3/-3. It's an aura. Then we got Valki, God of Lies. This card is actually very strong in 2 reasons. One, in the early game, we can use Valki, God of Lies to disrupt our opponent if they're playing something more on the aggro side, because when we play Valki on the Valki side, we get to look at their hand. We get to exile a target creature card from their hand underneath Valki until Valki leaves the battlefield, and then we can tap X and choose creature card exiled with Valki, convert it mana cost X, and Valki becomes a copy of that card. So essentially, we can make Valki into whatever our opponent's playing by paying that X mana cost. On top of that, we could call the Death Dweller, which helps us reoccur some of our things back from the graveyard. Essentially, this is like another benefit here. Being able, 1, to bring something back, 2, give it a Death Touch and Menace counter is also a benefit, which helps us kind of keep threats and pressure on our opponent overall. Then we have Pelika Perdition, which is a 3 mana, target opponent reveals their hand. We get to choose a card with a converted mana cost 3 or greater. This kind of helps us against more of those control matchups where our opponent's trying to get something like maybe strong like an Ugin or something on overall in that manner. And then we get to make our opponent discard that card. The other benefit here is if maybe our opponent's playing something more on the aggro side and they're not playing any big cards, we can always play it on the battlefield as a tap land if we have mana. Aghady's Awakening is another card here that helps us get back to the graveyard. Our opponent may have played. It's not really cost us more than probably 5 mana at most, because most of our creatures in the deck all our creatures in the deck other than Lurrus are 2 or less, so that's that benefit. At most, it's going to be 6, because we may have to throw Lurrus back to the graveyard to the battlefield in that manner. Worst case scenario, we played as the other side, which is the land side. We can pay 3 life and actually play it in the battlefield untap, but most of the time, this is like our another insurance to help get Lurrus back on the battlefield if it does die. Then to round it out, we have Hagra Maulin. It's just a removal spell. It's just just in case removal spell, in case Mire's Grass and Deadweight aren't going to be enough to kill a particular creature. And we can also play it as a removal spell on the other, or we can also play it as a land on the other side if in case we don't need the removal spell. And the mana base is pretty straightforward. We are playing 12 Swamps. We're playing 1 Castle Lock Queen as another way to help draw and get some more advantage if our hands get a bit late in the later game by paying some life and drawing a card equal to the number of cards we have in our hand. We lose life equal to the number of cards in hand and we draw a Then we got 4 of the Blight Step / Seer Step pathways. It just has the splash of red in the deck just so that we can possibly play the Tybalt side of Valky, which I didn't actually go over, which I'll go over after I go over plans. And then we also have 2 copies of the Savoy Triome as well, yet again to splash the red to help us play the other side of Valky and play the Tybalt. As well as in the late game, if we don't need the additional red, we can always cycle it for 3 mana and hopefully draw a spell that we may need. But the idea here is in the late game, if we kind of set up the board to have kind of empty threats, so our opponents don't really have too much going on the board, we play Tybalt, the Cosmic Imposter. Essentially, if you haven't played up against this or played this card, he's actually fairly good, I would say, because one of 2 things. When he enters the battlefield, we get an emblem. We play cards exiled by Tybalt, and we can spend mana as though it was mana of any color to cast those spells. So essentially here we get +2, we get the exile top card of each player's library. So our opponent's library, we take a card, our library, we take a card, put it off to the side. Even if Tybalt's not on the battlefield, we still have the emblem on the battlefield, and at any point we play those cards on the battlefield. The second ability here is -3, exile target artifact or creature. So essentially, depending on where we're at in the game, if we're around turn 7, our opponent may have a big threat. We don't really have, Mire's Grass or Deadweight is not going to do it. We can always -3. Now we exile that creature. Now because we have emblem, we can at any point play that creature against our opponent. And if we ever get to the -8, we can exile all cards from all graveyards and add 3 red mana. And essentially what this now does is all the cards we exile this way are now playable by Tybalt. And we have 3 mana to play those cards, essentially. Now, the way this deck works, outside of that, is Lurrus is our way that we're going to reoccur some of these spells. Because Lurrus's ability is each permanent card in our graveyard has to be less than 2, which each creature card in our graveyard has to be less than 2, which it is. And during each of our turns, we may cast up to 1 permanent spell with a permanent cost 2 or less from the graveyard. And essentially, all this stuff in here, other than the few instance spells, are recastable with Lurrus. So we can always play a Mire's Grass if we need to, kill a particular creature that is 3 power or less. We can always play another Deadweight for 1 mana that, if we need to kill a creature with -2/-2. We can get back creatures from the graveyard, like Fateful Eidolon if it died early. We can get back our 2 Vessels, so that we can try to get the 5/5. We can get back Heights of Freebooters. We can get back Valkyries. Though we don't get back the Tybalt, just in case. You can't flip it. You can't play Lurrus and get back the Tybalt. It has to be the Valky, I believe. So Lurrus is like our insurance to get back any of these spells and kind of make it annoying for our opponent, because now we just have answers for a lot of the creatures. And as long as our opponent doesn't really have any sort of removal, if we get into that cycle of there's reoccurring Mire's Grass and Deadweights, we're overall gonna annoy the opponent to the point that we're just gonna grind them down, and then they're either gonna give up or we're gonna slowly beat them down that way. Now when it comes to the deck, overall the deck is yet again on the cheaper side. Yet again, this is also at 15 total rares / mythics. The reason why I rank this as number 2 is actually it's heavier on the mythic side and a little bit less on the rare side. So it's 7 rares and 8 mythics. So I would say it's a little bit on the more expensive side when it comes to MTG Arena, because of the higher requirement of the mythics. This is actually the highest requirement of mythics out of all the decks I'm going over. But I would say the deck is on the simple side. Yet again, we are kind of playing this early aggressive full game, just trying to keep our opponent's early threats off the battlefield and just reoccurring them over and over again. I would say the strength of the deck is at a 1 out of 3, because of if our opponent's not playing a lot of creatures, a lot of what we're trying to do here is not as effective. So we're going to definitely struggle, especially if our opponent's playing if they're trying to go for the long game. Overall, the cost though, because there's only 15 total rares and mythics in the deck, I would rank this as 1 as well, just because it is on the cheaper side when it comes to building a deck. It doesn't require a super heavy investment, though I would say sometimes it's harder to get wild cards in MTG Arena, but because there's a balance of rares and mythics, you may have 8 rares and 8 mythic wild card seeds to craft the deck overall. Yet again, if you're looking to kind of draw the deck back, I'm going to refer to a version of this deck that I did that's a budget version of the deck. There'll probably be a link for it somewhere up here. I think it's in one of my budget videos of a list of decks that you could possibly play. So you definitely want to check that out if you want to see like a budget version of the deck. But yet again, I would always recommend, if you want to try to cut back, you can always cut back on the lands, play the tap lands that would do the same thing. If you don't want to play something like Valky, I would just try to find something that does the Valky side of it. Tybalt side is going to be impossible to kind of find a replacement for, but if you want to find something that's going to disrupt your opponent's early game, you can always just replace it with a two mana card that does something simpler. You know, Hand Hate, where you tap 2 mana, make your opponent exile a target card. I can't think of the card's name off the top of my head. It's been a minute since I've played the card. You can also play the other card that's kind of like Kitesail Freebooter, but it actually hits, I believe, creatures instead. No, it's the one for the party, and you can make your opponent discard a single card equal to the number of creatures in your party. So if you play a 2-drop, make your opponent reveal a card and discard that card for 2 is another thing I would say. I would say the one thing that is a must for the deck is probably the Lurrus, just on the basis of he or she is, or they are the one that's going to be the companion that's going to help you reoccur a lot of your early game to kind of be that annoying overall thing. Like I said, if you want to check out the budget version, link will be somewhere up here for you to check that out. But I would say this is probably the deck, if you're looking for something that's a little bit on the more control side. So, if you're someone who's been playing Magic the Gathering maybe for a little bit more than just the past maybe month or two, before Kaldheim release, this was the deck that you probably saw a bunch of in the meta as a whole and probably were so annoyed with, and that deck is Dimir Rogues. Overall, the deck is pretty straightforward. It's a rogue tribal deck, so essentially we are just taking the benefit of playing rogues. We are also using Lurrus in the deck, so most of all our creatures in the deck don't cost more than 2 mana. The deck is overall pretty straightforward. This is like a deck that kind of does one of those things that it grinds our opponent's deck down by milling them, by triggering this mill ability our rogues do cause when they either attack or come into the battlefield. We play a card called Rune Crab, which is a 1-drop that essentially every time we play a land, if it's out on the battlefield, we get to actually make our opponent mill 3 cards. So just slowly grinding our opponent's deck down to the point that either we mill them or we get a lot of cheap things out on the battlefield and we just kill them that way. Like I said, the deck is pretty straightforward. I think there's a version of this deck that's kind of is a little bit more evolved to the current meta, but I still think this list here is pretty decent for what it's trying to do. This one is like a little bit more of the mill side, and it's on the cheaper side out of the 2 lists that would be going around for Dimir Mill. Overall, the deck is, like I said, on the cheap side. It is 17 rares and 1 mythic, or 2 mythics, I should say. Sorry. And you don't need all of them to really perform very well in the deck, but you can it does help to have the mythics and rares to actually do it. So like I said, Lurrus is our companion, helps us get things back from the graveyard with a tournament cost 2 or less, makes things more annoying for our opponent to actually deal with if they can't just graveyard. In our 1-drop slot, we have Merfolk Windrobber. It's a 1-mana flyer. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, that player mills a card. So essentially, it's one of our ways to make our opponent mill a card every time it hits them in the face for damage. In the later game, if our opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard, we can actually sacrifice it. We can draw a card. It helps us dig a little bit deeper into our deck to maybe find a new answer or rogues or more threats. Then we got Rune Crab, which is another 1-drop. It's a 0/3. Every time we play a land, we get to mill our opponent for 3 cards. So definitely annoying in that sense. It definitely hurts our opponent. It doesn't help it. Like, we kind of counteract our opponent trying to set anything up on the top of their library because we have a way to build them every time we play a land on our turn. Bloodchief's Thirst, which is a very strong 1-drop removal spell at sorcery speed. Destroy target creature or planeswalker for that cost 2 or less. You can kick in the later game and destroy target creature or planeswalker that costs any cost, essentially. Then you got Thieves Guild the Forcer, which is a flash card. It's a 1-mana 1/1. This is one of the cards I would say that is a must for the deck to kind of help make it work. Whenever it enters the battlefield or another rogue enters the battlefield, we get to mill our opponent 2 cards. As long as our opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard, it gets +2/+1 in Deathtouch, which makes it even more annoying because now it's a 3/2, and has Deathtouch, so it makes it very awkward for one block and or be blocked by. We got 1 copy Eliminate, 2 copies of Heartless Act, just kind of spreading around the removal spell into this little pocket of 1 and 2 mana. Then you got Drown in the Lock, which is like our only counter spell in the deck, as well as an additional removal to get rid of anything that's maybe larger based on the number of cards in their graveyard. So 1 encounter target spell might cost less than or equal to the number of cards in controller's graveyard. If we get to 8, it counters a lot of things in the meta. If we get to 8 as well for the second part, it destroys target creature with the same effect. 8 or, if we get them to 8, you can destroy any creature with may cost 8 or less, essentially, as long as it doesn't have hexproof. Then you got Sorin Thought Thief, which is like another rogue lord. It's a 2-mana 1/3 flash fly-in. As long as our opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard, rogues we control get +1/+0. And whenever 1 or more rogues we control attacks, our opponent now mills 2 cards. So essentially every time even any of our rogues attack, the minute we tap them and it goes into swing at our opponent, they're going to mill 2 cards automatically regardless of them damage, which makes this overall better. Then we got Mystical Dispute, a 1/of. You know, if our opponent's playing, you know, a blue deck or has blue in their spells, we can pay it for 1 mana. It makes it cost 2 less. If we pay it for its full cost, essentially it's just counter target spell unless its controller pays 3. It's a way to disrupt our opponent. You don't have to play it. You can also play something like Lofty Denial because we do have flyers in the deck. But yet again, you have to have flyers in order for that to be super effective. But it's one of those things that you can always mess around with. Then we got Of One Mind, essentially a way for us to draw 2 cards, and it costs 2 less if we control a human and a non-human creature. So essentially, if we have, you know, Sorin Thought Thief and something like a Mirror Wind Robber, we can draw 2 cards for only 1 mana. Then we got Call the Death Dweller, which is another way for us to recur things from the graveyard that maybe if we don't have Lurrus out, give them Death Touch and Menace, which makes them harder to block. We got Lul's Mage Domination, which is a 3 mana initial control target creature with red may cost X. If this spell costs 3 less if our opponent has 8 or more cards in the graveyard, so essentially for 3 blue mana, you can essentially control target creature with a red may cost 3. Which definitely is pretty good, or less, I guess, is essentially, because then you pay whatever hypothetical mana that's 3 or less, and it helps us kind of, you know, stall our opponent from playing their later game. Agadeem's Awaken, just like Call the Death Dweller, want it to be a land that we can put in the battlefield untap for 3 mana, 3 life, or we can target creatures back from our graveyard with a red may cost X or less of 3 to, you know, all the different costs depending on what we pay. Besides Lurrus, most of the time we're going to probably pay 5. If we have Lurrus on the battlefield and it gets removed, we can always pay 6 and essentially get back all, you know, one of each of these piles here. And then after that, our only expensive card in the deck is technically Into the Story, but yet again, it's a card that benefits from our opponent having 8 or more cards in the graveyard, or 7 or more cards in the graveyard, and essentially it's an instant speed draw spell that we can draw 4 cards for essentially 4 mana, which makes it overall strong. And then the mana base is pretty straightforward. We have 5 islands, 4 swamps. You know, we got 4 copies of Clearwater Pathway. We have 4 copies of Zagoth Triumph and 4 copies of Fabled Passage. Like I said, the deck overall is pretty straightforward in what we're trying to do. We're trying to mill our opponent. So I will say, because this deck does splash a little bit of blue in it, it makes it a little bit more on the control side / reactive side. Because we're trying to react to what our opponent's doing, we got to kind of read what our opponent's doing and kind of react to what they're doing. So our opponent's playing aggressive and we want to, you know, surprise them. We may want to play something like a Thieves Guild Enforcer and surprise them, or set, you know, something like that up. You know, we can always set up with a Sorin Thought Thief, because that kind of stops a lot of the early, you know, creatures that maybe only 1/1s and things like that. And it being a 1/3 makes it definitely, you know, a very good blocker against those more aggressive creatures. And the other thing too is we want to kind of get that mill engine going. Once we kind of start getting that mill engine going, we kind of grind down our opponent. And as, you know, they start getting deeper and deeper into their deck, as their deck kind of starts to pull away, it gets to that point that if we can kind of get that process going, our opponent is, you know, hoping that we kind of draw one of their many, you know, one of their very few copies at that point, cards left that may be able to deal with us. And if this deck actually overall has a pretty decent curve out overall when it's trying to do, you know, by turn 3, turn 4 at the latest, I wouldn't be surprised if, you know, your opponent's like deck is a third of the way gone, as long as you were able to play pretty decently on curve. And by the time you hit turn 4, turn 5, your opponent's either, you know, scooping, or because you know, got their life points down to 0, or they're scooping at the point that they don't really have any hope of, you know, pulling the game out, which is definitely on, you know, a benefit. Now, as for overall for the score, I would say the deck is a 3 out of all the decks that I'm going to be going over in today's video. Like I said, it does take, you know, you kind of have to read what your opponent's doing and kind of react to it. So it does take a little bit more on the thinking process. There's also a control aspect to it too. You know, you don't want to drown in the lock at the wrong time, and, you know, you may drown in the lock, counter target spell, then your opponent plays a spell to follow it. So you kind of have to read, you know, is this a spell I want to counter? The other thing too is, because there's creatures splash, you may want to, you know, leave that mana open and kind of, you know, bluff that you may have a creature or actually play the creature. It definitely makes your opponent very hesitant. This deck does take some you know, probably some games to kind of figure out what works, what doesn't work, and then figure out, you know, strategy overall. So I would say this is probably a little bit more on the difficult side, so I would give it a 3 overall out of out of 3 for difficulty. The strength of the deck is probably at a 2. This deck was very popular before Kaldheim. It's kind of fallen out of that, good graces because of some of these newer decks that kind of come into the meta as a whole. So I give it a 2 because it's probably somewhere in the middle right now of the field when it comes to overall strength compared to the field. And then cost, yet again, it is my 3rd cheapest deck on the list. It is 17 rares and 1 mythic. Yet again, majority of the rares in the deck, though, are all in the lands, so you can always cheapen out and, use uncommon versions of the lands or common versions of the lands, and then slowly work your way into building the lands, or, vice versa. Doesn't require too many mythics, if any, other than the Agadeem's Awakening, so, that's something that you may have a couple of to actually get in the deck. So I would say, if anything, if you're tight on budget, I would say, you get the heart of the deck, because this heart of the deck will help you actually be able to play the deck properly, and then slowly work your way into building the actual overall mana base. Now, this next deck on the list is actually a deck that I do enjoy, and yet again, I find it to be yet again, a very simple deck on what it's trying to do, and that is Izzet aggro. It's the overall idea of this deck is that we're playing a balance of creatures and spells. And the idea here is we're trying to, get our opponent to pretty much hit him like real hard all in one turn. Essentially, the way this works is there's a new card from Kaldheim that's called Dual Strike. Essentially, we can foretell it, and then whenever we cast the next instant or sorcery spell with minimum cost 4 or less, copy that spell, you may choose new targets for the copy. So here's the setup, because I've seen this done many a times wrong in the arena when it comes to actually playing it. So if you're going to cast something like an Unleashed Fury, you want to play the Dual Strike first. You want to play the foretell cost and play it. Then you cast a Dual Strike, so essentially now this is now active. Then you play the Dual Strike, which now will copy the Unleashed Fury. I've seen people play it wrong, where you play the Unleashed Fury and then you play the Dual Strike. If you do it in that order, nothing happens. And you get one copy of Unleashed Fury, and then Dual Strike does nothing, and you have a floating Dual Strike ability on the battlefield until the end of turn. Or until you, I guess it doesn't say end of turn, I just realized. So I guess until you play your next instant or sorcery spell. So, or this turn. Okay, never mind. It says this turn. I didn't read it. So if you play in that order, you're not going to get anything. But overall, the deck is pretty straightforward on what it's trying to do. We're trying to play things like, Sprite Dragons, Phoenix of Ash, Storming Entities, and Brazen Borrowers, kind of disruptive things. Also got Riddle Form in the deck, which also helps out. But overall, we'll start at the beginning of the deck. We play 2 copies of Op for a little bit of scry and draw action. Helps our non-creature, it's a cheap spell to help pump our creatures that get benefits of us playing non-creature spells. Unsummon yet again to disrupt what our opponent's doing. Nothing's worse than your opponent playing, nothing's worse than being the player. You play something for 3 mana that uses all your mana, and immediately your opponent bounces that card back to the hand. Infuriate to help pump our creatures, because we're playing Unleashed Fury. We want cards that are going to pump our power of our creatures, so that when we play an Unleashed Fury, it hits really hard and very effectively. 4 copies of Shock to disrupt our opponent's early game if they play small creatures. 2 damage to a creature just kind of disrupts what they're trying to do. Then we got Riddle Form, which is a 2 mana enchantment, but whenever we cast a non-creature spell, we can make it a 3/3 Sphinx creature with flying in addition to its other types until end of turn. And then we can always use it in the later game if we're looking for something particular. We can always tap 3 and we can scribe 1, and essentially help us find maybe the next non-creature spell, or maybe an Unleashed Fury if we're trying to get to that point. Like I said, then we got Unleashed Fury, which is instant speed, which is, I think, got a lot more favor in the overall meta as a whole, because essentially what it is for 2 mana, we have to double the power of target creature until end of turn. So essentially, what we're trying to do here is, get either, like I said, our Sprite Dragon, Phoenix of Ash, Brazen Borrower, Storming Entity, attacking, triggering some of their abilities like Prowess and or this one, and we then essentially double their power, whatever it is. So if it's a 3/3, then it becomes a 6/6. Combine it with things like Infuriate, before we play something like Unleashed Fury, then we can make it, a 6/6 already. Then we double their power, then it's a 12, then it's a 12/6, so that's good. Combine that with something like a Dual Strike that essentially now, doubles the power even more, so it takes it 12 to then 24. So then essentially it's all like a 1 hit, and your opponent's done for. So that's how that works. Like I said, we got Sprite Dragon. I have the alternate art on, so it is Sprite Dragon. It says it very small if you can't read it. It's a Flying Haster that's a 1/1, but every time we cast a non-creature spell, we get some counter on it. So essentially, in the early game, it's not very strong, but in the later game, as we start playing our ops and our unsummons, infuriates, shocks, and so on, it'll become stronger and stronger and stronger. Then you got Brazen Borrower for the disruption for the 2 mana for the Petty Theft by returning non-land permanent opponent controls back to their hand, so just another card to bounce card back to their hand. And in the later game, we can get a flash flyer that can only block creatures with flying. That's a 1, so it has a double effect in that sense. Then of course you got Phoenix of Ash. It's a 3 mana 2/2 flying haster. It's a 3 mana. We can pump it by giving it +2/+0 at the end of turn. And if it gets removed to the graveyard, we can actually exile 3 other cards from our graveyard, and we can escape it for 4 mana and give it +1/+1 counter on it, so it comes back as a 3/3 and has haste and flying as well. Then of course we have the Storming Entity, which is another card that is very good for the deck because it's a 5 mana 3/3, which doesn't seem that great. Has flying and prowess. Prowess is an ability whenever we cast a non-creature spell, this creature gets +1/+1 at the end of turn. So essentially, like I said, you play things like Dual Strike, Unleash Fury together. So essentially we played those 2 cards. We play Dual Strike first, becomes a 4/4. Then we play Unleash Fury, becomes a 5/5, double its power. It becomes a 10/5, double its power again, becomes 25. This literally becomes a one-hit combo in that sense if we play those 2 cards in a single turn. It doesn't get removed in that process. And also, whenever the spell costs 3 less if we cast an instant or sorcery spell this turn. So you can play this something behind an opt. So we opt first, then we play this for 2 mana. So essentially it does cost us 3 mana, but we didn't pay that much. We didn't have to pay the 5 to actually play it out that way. Also, when it comes into the battlefield, we can enter the battlefield and we get the scry too, so we can kind of set up our cards and maybe find like an Unleash Fury, maybe find another non-creature spell that we want to play or something like that, or maybe even find a land if we really need it. The mana base is yet again straightforward because it's a 2-color deck: 5 islands, 9 mountains, 4 of the river glide / lava glide pathways, and 4 of the entities. Overall, the budget of this deck isn't super duper expensive. It comes in at 15 rares and 4 mythics. You know, it's one of those things. Yet again, you don't have to play the Brazen Borrower. You can always play a card that also is a disruption. That's a non-creature spell and just kind of get rid of a creature. You can always, you know, swap out the rare lands if you really need it that way. I would say the cards that you definitely need in the deck to help really make it perform fairly well is probably the Phoenix of Ash, Storming Entity, and Sprite Dragon package. Because if you probably chop down too many creatures, you really won't have any threats in the deck, and you kind of like you draw more non-creature spells than actually things to use them on. So I'd at least keep this package here of these 3 guys all together. Now, as for overall, the deck is probably at a 2 when it comes to simplicity, just because yet again you kind of want to play your cards just in the right manner. There is, you know, as easy and straightforward the deck may seem initially. If you don't play cards in a certain way, or try not to, you know, figure out, you know, exactly how to set up, you know, these one-hit kills and things like that, I would say, you know, that's where it kind of ranks in the middle, because it is a little bit of a thought process to make sure you set everything up properly and do the proper amount of damage. As for strength, I'd probably rank it as well in the middle at a 2 out of 3, just because it's super effective when it works, and then there's always at times when it just doesn't work and you kind of feel like, you know, you're not doing much. So that's why I kind of rank it in the middle, because it can be it can be really good, and it can also be really bad. So I'd say that kind of equals out, so that's why I'm at a 2. As for cost, it's also at a 2. Yet again, it's my second most expensive deck in the video. Sure, it doesn't cost a lot of mythics, but still 15 rares is kind of on the steeper side. 4 mythics isn't the worst. So that's why I rank it as well at, you know, a 2. It's kind of like in that middle range. You know, it's kind of on that fringe of it's almost to the point of, you know, it could be a more expensive, you know, competitive deck. But, you know, there's cards you can always, you know, cut back to still make it a decent, you know, not super duper expensive deck. Like I said, you can cut back, you know, the lands to kind of, you know, cut costs that way. But and you can also cut back the Brazen Borrowers if you don't have that many mythics. But overall, it's not, you know, the worst when it comes to, you know, making it work depending on the budget you are working with. So this next deck on the list is actually a deck I already kind of covered just recently on the channel, and that is Jeskai Cycling. I covered Cycling already once on the video, and I did the budget version, which is Auras, and that deck only requires 1 rare. So I thought this deck is kind of like a cool evolution to kind of show you like a little bit more on the competitive side of Cycling, where it is currently in standard meta as a whole. And this deck is actually fairly interesting. So this one plays the additional blue mana in the deck, and we can kind of use the blue spells if we really need to. But it actually adds in a few other, you know, combat, you know, cycling tricks to help us take benefits of us, you know, cycling cards. So the way it does this is actually something from Improbable Alliance. It's a 2 mana card enchantment that whenever we draw our second card each turn, we get to create a 1/1 blue fairy creature creature token with fly-in. The reason why this is pretty good is, one, it puts pressure on our opponent because now we have 1/1 flyers that we can ping our opponent for 1 damage a turn as we, play them. And there's a good chance that we are definitely, drawing 2 cards on our turn as long as we have cyclers in the deck. And in the worst case scenario, we can always tap it for 6 mana. We can draw a card and discard a card and, draw that way. But most of the time, it's definitely a good benefit to kind of get a creature for us drawing the card. It's another way that our opponent can't really target, our Valiant Rescuer doesn't stay in the battlefield. We definitely have another way to produce creatures. And because the deck plays a bunch of cyclers, it's definitely easy to kind of, start pumping out some creatures. Now, the other 2 cards in the deck that kind of help us with this overall basis is we have a card called Ironcrag Pyromancer. It's a 3-mana 0/4, and when we draw our second card each turn, it deals 3 damage to any target. So essentially, now gives our second draw a turn a way for us to deal 3 damage wherever we want. We can either do the opponent's face, to a planeswalker, and or a creature they may control. So essentially, if we are able to draw 2 cards on our turn, our opponent's turn, we're going to be able to do 3 damage to whatever. So definitely a good way to kind of, be a little bit more on the aggressive side, and definitely complement something like a Drannith Stinger as well. So, because Drannith Stinger does 1 damage every time we cycle a card, combine that with whenever we draw our second card a turn, we're now going to deal 3 damage to whatever we want to. Now, the last card here is Riel, the Everwise. It's 3-mana 0/3. It has +1/+0 for each instant or sorcery card in our graveyard. And a lot of our, spells we cycle are instants or sorceries. So this thing can be pretty good. It can become like a 5/3, 6/3 pretty easily because, a lot of our cards cycle for 1 mana. So it easily, pumps it up that way. The other thing, though, that's actually very good about this card is not just that, is the second ability. It's whenever we discard a card discard 1 or more cards for the first time each turn, we have to draw that many cards. And the one thing, the way Cyclone's worded is essentially the way Cyclone works, if I get on a Cyclone card properly, is we pay the Cyclone card, or Cyclone cost to discard a card, and then draw a card. So essentially what this means is now when we ever cycle a card, we're actually going to draw 2 cards for the price of 1. So Riel is another good card to help us replenish that card. Now sure, we only do it once a turn, so even if we can cycle multiple cards in a single turn, it's not going to, produce us additional cards, but it helps us, draw, cards on our opponents, draw an additional card on our opponent's turn when we cycle, draw an additional card on our turn when we cycle. Definitely a good way to get, pretty decent value out of our 1 mana pain cycle. Overall, other than that, the deck is pretty straightforward and very similar to the budget cycling deck I already went over in my a couple of videos ago. I'll have a link for that one in the description where you can actually see some gameplay of that deck. But like I said, the mana base kind of evolved a little bit. We actually play some Triomes in the deck. We have one Savoy Triome, which, is there, to, have the additional weight in red, as well as we have the Jeskai Triome, which is the Ragnar Triome, which, produces the Jeskai mana, which helps us play these cards in our deck. We also have 4 copies of each of the pathways that produce these colored manas that we need to actually play these cards, as well as 1 copy of an island and 1 copy of a mountain. The mana base, we don't have a ton of mana in the deck. I think this comes in at like 18 mana, but because we have so many ways to draw cards in our deck, we have a good chance of definitely drawing to that. I don't think I need to go too much over what the deck does. We play the Flourishing Fox. Whenever we cycle, we get a +1/+1 counter, or we cycle 1. Drannith Healer, every time we cycle, we gain a life. Valiant Rescuer, every time we cycle, we get the 1 Soldier token. Startling Development, because now we're actually using it. It's not just a cycle thing. We can actually make target creature become a Blue Serpent with base power, toughness, 4/4. If you find something like that with a Flourishing Fox, you can actually take a Flourishing Fox for 1/1 base and turn it into a 4/4 base plus the counters, so it can, cost me an extra 3 points of damage and get your opponent off guard if they decide to block out on the early game you have mana open. Drannith Stinger, every time we cycle, deal 1 damage to each opponent. Go for Blood is like our fight spell if we really want to fight a creature and kind of remove it. If you get like a decent sized Flourishing Fox, it makes Go for Blood a pretty decent way to, some creatures that may be in our way. Kind of already went over this part, so we don't really have to go over them, but they are definitely good cards to help us, benefit us from drawing multiple cards. Zenith Flare is like our way to finish out the game. If we get like 10, cycling cards in the graveyard, we hit our opponent really hard with Zenith Flare. We're gonna probably finish our opponent off at that point, and gain, that much life. Frostveil Ambush is just another way to tap on our opponent's creatures if we really need to, and we really need to, possibly stall them for 1 more turn. Yet again, it's just a 1 mana cycler. Then we got Boon of the Wishgiver. Yet again, if we get to the 6 mana, we can draw 4 cards, but, worst case scenario, we always cycle it for 1 mana and draw a card. And like I said, the mana base is pretty straightforward. And I do have a Boros version of this deck that's super budget. All it has is a Lurrus. This version doesn't actually play a Lurrus because we actually play 3 drops. So that's probably the real big difference there. So you can always eventually work your way towards this version of the deck. And when it comes to simplicity, I would say, you know, this deck is on one of the more simpler decks on the concept. You know, cycle, try to get the effects of benefits of a cycling to, you know, do whatever it is to get, you know, advantage that way. Strength, cycling's actually one of the better decks in the format as a whole, because as much as, you know, your opponent can be doing the mono white things or the mono red things or even the Sultai Ultimatum things, if you get a pretty decent curve out with this deck, you can definitely, you know, get that, you know, definitely, you know, get them dead before they can even say go. And then overall cost, you can play this deck a version of cycling for 1 rare, if you really want to play the Lurrus. You don't even have to play the Lurrus and not even play a single rare. You can still make the deck work with just being Boros and just, you know, throwing in some more, you know, uncommon or common cycling cards to just fill it out. And overall, you know, this deck, like I said, is probably the strongest deck in the format. This version, like I said, is, I don't know if I said it, but it is 22 rares and 1 mythic, which is the 1 real. But like I said, you can always work your way to, you know, going from Boros to Jeskai as you kind of accrue the currency. Like most of the decks, there is probably a budget version that you can play by cutting things back and then eventually work your way into the full version. And this is definitely an interesting deck to kind of see how it does and stacks up as the meta kind of evolves, if it's going to evolve any further. But like I said, this is probably your best deck currently out of the list I went with, and probably even, you know, very easy and straightforward if on the simpler side. So with that being said, guys, I mean, overall, I mean, each of these decks are fairly interesting. So, I mean, you know, I kind of tried my best to give you a little bit of variety of the decks. I mean, sure, they're all aggro, because if you are playing a best of 1 meta, the meta is, right now, unless you're playing Sultai Ultimatum, is probably on the most part aggro. And these are probably the cheapest of the competitive decks that are currently in the meta as a whole. If you want to leave me any feedback on the ranking system I'm using and kind of give your input on what you think works and what you think doesn't, leave a comment down below. It definitely is one of those things I'm working, trying to figure out in progress. At some point, I'll probably try to leave like something on the screen so you can kind of see it. The other thing too, if you like the video, hit me with a like button. It definitely lets me know you guys like these style of videos. And if you're new here and want to know if I post a video on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But I'll see you in the next video.